Welcome to an O'Connor Institute and Civics for Life conversation with Johnny A. Burtka IV. I'm Liam Julian with the O'Connor Institute. John A. Burtka IV is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. He graduated from Hillsdale College with degrees in French and Christian Studies and earned a graduate degree in theology from La Faculté Jean Calvin in Aix-en-Provence, France. Johnny began his career at ISI, where he served as a development officer. He returned to ISI after 4 years at the American Conservative magazine, where he served as executive director and acting editor. And he is the editor of a new book, Statesmanship: Selections from Xenophon to Churchill, which we'll be talking about today. Johnny, thanks a lot for joining us to talk about this book.
Thanks for having me, Liam. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah. So obviously, this is a really important time. I guess there's not an unimportant time to talk about statesmanship, but we're in an election season, and so the book kind of takes on a sort of added importance in that sense. But maybe you can start by telling us what we mean by statesmanship in this context. What is it that we are talking about?
Sure. I mean, to put it simply, statesmanship is really the art of governing, the art of leading a body politic. And the focus of the book is really rediscovering an ancient tradition called the Mirrors for Princes. Now, most people haven't heard of the Mirrors for Princes, but these were really advice manuals that were that were often pretty short and contained proverbial wisdom. And in the ancient world, when you had a new king or queen, these were presented by a court minister who wanted to serve as an advisor. And it often contained, pieces of moral advice, pieces of policy advice that they might be able to implement. And then in return, the author was hoping they might get offered a job in the cabinet, so to speak, of the ancient world. Obviously, as you fast forward throughout history, this was, very popular up through the Renaissance. And then after the Enlightenment, the genre begun to fall out of favor for various different reasons. But many of the texts that are included, whether it's Cicero's On Duties or Machiavelli's The Prince, among others, would have been familiar with America's own founding fathers.
So, what was your motivation to take on this project now? Do you see that some of the some of the teachings in these writings have been forgotten? Did you feel like we just needed to revisit these? What was the motivation for the collection?
Sure. Well, it was really motivated for a couple reasons. The first is that, studying history, I'm a huge biography fan. Nearly every civilization, every country throughout human history has had this genre of literature. They've all come together as a community, particularly at the higher levels, and they've written down the qualities that they wanted to see in their political leaders. And then they created the institutions necessary to pass those on to the next generation. America is actually one of the only nations, especially given its prominence on the world stage, that really doesn't have a formal tradition like this. And so, given that America is in a particularly polarizing political moment, I thought it might be worth posing the question, what if America had its own tradition of offering advice to political leaders? And could we perhaps learn from this ancient tradition? And I should add that the tradition that I've included not only contains, Greek and Roman and classic Western texts. I also include texts from ancient India and China and the Islamic world, as well as the Jewish tradition. So it really is showing the full scope of kind of statesmanship broadly understood.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, you really do get the sense that this is a global project from the book. You've organized it very broadly in terms of time periods. Why was the decision to do that?
Sure. I mean, anytime you try to put sort of labels on time periods, it's always a little bit tricky because the
Yeah.
reality is far more messy than that. So I divided it between ancient, medieval, and modern. The ancient world, I would say, is really kind of a look at statecraft in the pre-Christian world. I say pre-Christian world because I think many of the conceptions about statecraft shifted somewhat significantly from the what might be called the pagan world to the Christian world. Some of these changes also coincided with the rise of the Roman Empire, and the change that that brought about in kind of the political world at the time in the ancient Near East and throughout Europe. And then towards the modern world really begins with Machiavelli. Of course, the seeds of the changes from medieval to modern began probably during the Scholastic period, in the 12th century and onwards, leading up through the Renaissance. But it was really Machiavelli who, proposed a rupture, not necessarily with the ancient world, but with the Christian world that came before it, and essentially decoupled politics from religion, which then had kind of profound consequences later with the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment. So we're looking at it really through the lens of those three eras.
Yeah, that's funny that you bring up Machiavelli, because I saw him in this collection as the same, in the same sense of sort of moving into a kind of pragmatic understanding of governance. However, it was the case that in some of the earlier selections, there's one from China, I believe, where I also sense that there was a lot of pragmatism. But in other selections, Cicero or things like that, very very sort of morality directed. Can you talk about that? It's just fascinating because I saw that as a real interesting tension in the book between those different perspectives.
Yeah, that's right. And it operates on a couple levels. It's funny you should mention that because I actually read Han Fei, the Chinese legalist, and Machiavelli this morning in preparation for a donor retreat that I'm teaching on the book this coming weekend. Well,
Oh,
there's
so
a couple levels.
in
There's a couple.
preparation for the in preparation for teaching, not in preparation for talking to donors.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the donors have signed up for a weekend class on the book, which I'm really looking forward to. Um, so there's a couple aspects to it. One, this advice you have to remember. I think sometimes this gets lost today that the people that are political leaders, right? They're not philosophers, right? They might care about ideas to the extent that it helps them get elected or maintain power. But it's nothing new under the sun that leaders are ambitious. Sometimes they're ruthless. They're self-interested, and so part of the challenge with this genre is knowing that leaders are hard-headed. How do you write something that both contains some moral advice, because you want to call a leader to good and virtuous behavior, but there also needs to be a dose of self-interest or pragmatism, or it might just go totally over their head, or they might just ignore it altogether. And so some of the works in this tradition have much more of a practical bent, like Machiavelli and Han Fei. To your point, though, Cicero and many of the other Christian authors advising kings focused much more on the moralizing side of things and kind of had this message that, it didn't really matter what you accomplished in your earthly life. What matters is how you'll be judged for your conduct sort of in the afterlife, right? And so that led to a lot of advice that was, to your point, much more moralizing, which I think there's a place for moralizing, but I think also it's a bit of a challenge in when it comes to statesmanship, because a lot of statesmen don't really care about morals, right? And so you have to figure out how do you reach them. Now, Machiavelli, it's said by many prominent political philosophers that he was a rupture from literally everything that came before him, classical and Christian. I think that's a little bit of a mistake. I think he certainly is a break from the Christian tradition, but he's very much in line with not only the ancient Chinese advice, which really emphasized sort of ruthless pragmatism and an interest-based understanding of politics, very realist in nature. But I think you also see this in Xenophon in ancient Greece. You see it in other respects in ancient Rome as well. So I think Machiavelli is, in some respects, he gets a bad rap, and in some cases, rightly so. Some people have called him, quote unquote, a teacher of evil. But I think a lot of his advice really strikes me as quite pragmatic and having just a very sober assessment of human nature and what it takes to get and maintain power, which could be used either for good or for bad.
Yeah. Um, so you said at the outset that America doesn't really have this tradition, but you did include two selections from the United States, George Washington's farewell address, and Teddy Roosevelt citizenship in a republic, right?
That's right.
So, tell us, why did you think that those two fit in to this tradition? And why did you include them?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, the tradition largely fell out of favor by the time we get to the American founding, even though some of the texts were popular. So, what I was trying to do is sort of revive the tradition and think about what we might include from our own American tradition. And I think Washington's farewell address, for any listeners who haven't read it, I'd highly encourage you to read it. It might take 20, 30 minutes, but it's really this affectionate letter that Washington wrote with the help of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison at the end of his second term as president. And it really is, I would say, a very nonpartisan, kind of holistic assessment of where the young American nation was at, and what were the institutions that would be needed to really sustain our constitutional republic moving forward. He talks about everything from foreign policy to economics to our understanding of politics and partisanship and the virtues needed to hold the American regime together. So I find it beautiful, inspiring. There's actually a tradition in Congress, I believe it was in the Senate, that this would be read on an annual basis on George Washington's birthday. So just a beautiful and inspiring text that I think is worth rediscovering for today. The second one is Teddy Roosevelt. And I think both of these texts kind of show something about how America has changed. For Washington, I think it's very much a sense of the founders were creating a nation of laws, not a nation of men. These were going to be institutions that were put in place with checks and balances that would help to ensure whether or not you had a good person on top, that this kind of system could continue. So it was a very institutional approach, a hallmark of kind of the time and period in which he lived. Once you get to the 20th century, the idea of individuals and individual personality and charisma sort of emerges and plays a more prominent role in politics. So you see, Teddy Roosevelt, who has a great deal of respect for the founders and the Constitution, but also has a very peculiar sense of his own individual destiny and greatness and ambition. You really see that come through. And in his citizenship and a republic speech, he's really talking about the qualities of leaders, because he says, whatever the bar that you set for the leaders, the people they're going to rise to it, or they're going to lower to that level. And so he lays out his vision for really Republican statesmanship, but it also has a kind of a high understanding of his own role that he might play in that. He concludes it with his famous "Man in the Arena" speech, which talks about it's not the critic who counts; it's the one who really is out there putting their neck on the line, risking themselves, and whether they succeed or fail, at least they'll end up with they'll never end up with those timid souls who neither know victory or defeat.
Yeah, that's I remember that part of that, the man in the arena, and this notion that, even if you even if it's a total failure, it's better to be in there, acting. Yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting, and especially when contrasted with some of the other selections, where I think that the authors would would advise not to be, just kind
In
of,
the arena, yeah.
yeah, not to be as all in the arena. That's really interesting. So let me play the sort of. I'm just gonna be, the devil's advocate here.
Sure.
Okay, what about somebody who comes to you, and this person exists, who says, Johnny, great book. Love the selections. Really interesting stuff. But we're talking here about emperors. We're talking about kings. They're from thousands of years ago. What can we possibly learn from the way in which they governed, given the complete differences in structure of government then and now? What do you say to that person? How do you convince that person?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. It's one that I've received before. To me, as I mentioned earlier in the interview, I'm a huge biography fan. I've been listening to them nonstop for the past few years. And what I love about biographies is that it very quickly humanizes, in most cases, the character that you're studying. You get to see them at every aspect, every age of their life. You can see their faults, their virtues. You can even kind of see how you in your own life are comparing to this individual at a certain age or place and time. And I think in reading these biographies and kind of falling in love with these stories, you really start to see that there's nothing new under the sun. Kind of there's a a certain universal nature to human nature, right? That while circumstances change, religions change, systems of government change, kind of the core elements of what it means to be a good leader are applicable, whether or not you're the president of the United States or a governor, or you're the head coach of a football team, or you're the student council president. So I think those essential elements change, even though there are obviously pretty significant differences between a republic and an empire, a democracy and a monarchy.
Yeah. Um,
Think of, like, for an example, Game of Thrones. Right? This is sort of one of my favorite, television series.
yeah.
You would say, well, this is a fictional kind of medieval world with all sorts of crazy characters and religions and crazy, dragons flying around. But yet, oddly, in watching the show, you can learn all sorts of lessons about what to do and what not to do when it comes to politics. So I think it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, it's the same with literature, right? It's why we read King Lear today, and it's just as applicable. And yeah, for sure. So I hate to, ask you this because it's kind of like asking, which of your children you love the most. But if there's one selection in this book that you think for Americans today would be the selection that they should absolutely read and pay attention to. I know this is an on the spot question. You can pick two or three. It doesn't have to be one. But what do you think when you look at this book? What do you think are the ones that are sort of most applicable to our situation right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So great question. I mean, one of my favorites is actually the last one that I conclude with, which is Charles de Gaulle's The Edge of the Sword. And this is a little known book. And what I really am impressed with it by, for Americans, who don't know, Charles de Gaulle fought in World War I. He's a Frenchman. And basically, he got injured in World War I. He was a prisoner of war. He was probably in his early 30s. And he felt a lot of guilt and shame about the fact that he wasn't out there fighting with many of his countrymen, that he was instead, drinking coffee and reading magazines and old books in a prisoner of war camp. And so when he came out, he sat down, and he was probably late 30s by the time he wrote this. He sat down and he actually sketched out the ideal qualities that he would like to see in a leader in France in his own day. Now, he was inspired by Aristotle, he was inspired by Cicero, but these were kind of the qualities of leadership that he believed were really relevant for his particular moment. And so he wrote them on a piece of paper, he published that book, but he did it before he had really accomplished anything. He would then, in his later 40s, kind of lead the resistance against the Nazis. He would defeat, the Nazis. He would then become the president of the Fifth French Republic, and then usher in, not without controversy, but usher in a period of, economic growth and prosperity that is still talked about in France today. So here's a man who did what I think it's easy for us to kind of look at our contemporary political situation, and whether we're on the right or the left, kind of complain about how the country has gone to hell in a handbasket, and how nothing that we could do in the realm of politics is going to make a difference, because all of the actors, all of the players are so much bigger and more powerful than we are. But I think you see in de Gaulle someone who was quite young at the time, who sat down, who sketched out the vision of the man that he wanted to be, but it could be the man or woman that any of us want to be, kind of in the public realm. And then he devoted the rest of his life in a very, ambitious and courageous way to becoming that person. And it made a profound effect on the history of his country. So I think the message is really a hopeful one, that as bleak as it gets, we can't give up hope. And we also each individually have a role to play in our local communities and our families. And if we're blessed enough, perhaps in the nation at large.
Yeah, no, that's a great, yeah, that's a great choice. Yeah, I was wondering what you were going to pick. There's some, and I would tell, our viewers, there are so many rich selections here. One thing I kept, when I was reading it, I was like, how does one narrow down? I mean, in this sort of, as you're saying, the mirror. How do you narrow it down? Like, who did you exclude that you really wanted to include? What was that process like?
Yeah, well, it's a very difficult process, especially, I'm approaching this as, I'm not a PhD, I'm not a professor, so I'm really looking at this through the lens of, kind of which texts, actually impacted me personally, which texts have I reached out to people that I admire and respect, and they say, hey, you really should include this in your book. And so it can be a daunting task. And it's one of those things as an editor of a collection like this, you always, I'm satisfied that I was able to get 20 texts in the book because that's actually quite a bit. But at the same time, I'll discover something new, or I'll look back and I'll think, oh man, that probably wasn't the best fit. I could have picked something a lot better. And so it's really, you sort of, I would say maybe the secret to it is figuring out what books weren't just talked about in their own day, but really that you see other political leaders, other philosophers picking up again and again throughout history and referring to. And I think this excuse me, actually gets to one of the secrets that a Churchill biographer, Andrew Roberts, shared with me about political leadership. He said that in political leadership, there's something that's almost like an apostolic succession, but not for the Catholic Church, but for politics. And he was describing how Winston Churchill had a bust of Napoleon on his desk at all times. And evidently, Napoleon admired Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great admired Julius Caesar, and Julius Caesar, sorry, I got that wrong. Caesar admired Alexander the Great, and then Alexander the Great admired Cyrus the Great, right? And so you see, and Machiavelli talks about this as well in The Prince, how one of the secrets to great leadership is actually imitation of other great men and women who have come before you. And so it's in that tradition of imitation and taking a look at really which books have stood the test of time that I finally arrived at my list.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah, and I remember I remember in the White House there was controversy over the bust of Churchill, actually, because I think it gets to what you're talking about, because people do see that as sort of succession, and sort of, who are you imitating, and who are you looking up to? What does that mean for your leadership style? That's really interesting. So tell us, I mean, our viewers, obviously everybody should read this book. But there's more that they can do. You guys are putting out a sort of a series on each one of these selections. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So we're really excited about this. So what I did is I actually took a look at some of my favorite texts from this book and some of my favorite political leaders who are mentioned in the book and even beyond the book, and have put together a 14-part video series, which is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, called Daring Greatly with Johnny Burtka, where you can actually tune in to essentially 90-minute interviews with a mix of scholars and popular figures who have, deep kind of experience, or at least, a breadth of familiarity with some of these great thinkers. So if you really want to go deeper into the text, I'd encourage you to check out Daring Greatly with Johnny Burtka.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So read the book, and then for a deeper dive, go listen to these interviews with scholars. That's fantastic. All right, Johnny. Like, last question, and this can be an annoying question too, but this is a question that everybody sort of wants. Is sort of, what is, if you had to sum it up, the big takeaway here from the book that's sort of applicable to our current moment. And again, I know, as for somebody in history, it's not just about the current moment. But for somebody who is looking for that sort of, what is it that I should be taking from this text right now? What do you think that might be? What would you say to that person?
Yeah. So I think the fundamental lesson is that greatness and goodness are attainable for each and every one of us. It might look different in the sphere of life that we're in. Not everyone is going to be the president of the United States. But there are all things in our individual lives that, if we sort of take a step back from our hyper, online, kind of political and cultural moment where we're all glued to our phones, right? You can take a step back and you can study, and it's not, not boring to do. It can be fascinating. It can be interesting. There's different ways you can do it. But if you start to think about great and good individuals, heroes either throughout history, or it could even be people in your own life today, through imitation, through just thinking about the right things, the right qualities, the right virtues, those can start to trickle into your own life, and you can improve your circumstances. And I think that's within the reach of all of us, and we just need the courage to be able to step out and do that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point, which is that you can read these selections, and you don't have to be a prince to take away some really useful things from that. Fantastic. Well, Johnny, thanks for doing this, because it's no easy task to compile all this, as you were saying. I mean, to determine what's in, what's out, but it's also a really great service, I think, to bring these texts to people's attention again, and to keep them in front of people, so that we continue to sort of read and learn from them. So thank you for doing that. And thanks for taking time today to talk with us about it.
Yeah, it's an honor to be here. Thanks, Liam.